Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the AME Food Testing Show. Today's guest, Marc Sanchez, JD, MS, attorney and regulatory consultant. His topic, the new Food Safety Modernization Act regulations. Marc has a doctorate in jurisprudence as well as a master's degree in international communications policy. He's an attorney and a consultant with social media, privacy, food Safety Modernization Act compliance, recalls, USDA imports, FDA and CPSC compliance issues as his main focus. Marc's practice is in Atlanta, Georgia, primarily on product recalls, regulatory compliance, and employment law issues. He has a special interest and knowledge of food law and social policy media, privacy, publishing several articles and presenting throughout Washington on the topics including FDA compliance, food and medical device, recalls, import protocols, and employee privacy. Now, welcome with me, and I like to refer to him as Dr. Sanchez, Dr. Marc Sanchez. Marc?
Hi, Andy. Thank you for having me on.
Well, you're most welcome. Today's topic is extremely timely, and I'm sure many of our listeners who are food production, food quality, food safety, and food security managers are perplexed by the application of the new Food Safety Modernization Act regulations. Let's begin. Let's talk first about comment period and compliance dates.
This is a great place to start, and what we're talking about today is the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was implemented 2 years ago, but really is just now beginning. When it was first passed as legislation, that very few of the provisions went into effect immediately. Mandatory recall authority, a few things went into effect immediately. And what we were supposed to have is a year ago, the slow release of some rules, and these rules really would be the heart of the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA. But those were delayed, and we can go on a discussion about why they were delayed and what happened. But we finally got them. We've got 2 of about 7 new rules that are really big, bulky rules that are coming out. We had the produce safety rule that we're going to talk about today, and the preventative controls, it's also called the HARP-C rule that came out, and very, very dense rules. I think there's about 1,300 pages of just the regulations themselves, about 500 pages for produce safety, about 600 pages for the preventative controls. And what the FDA has said, and it's, what they've done for most regulations, is that there's a comment period, a period of time when you have to review the rules and to provide the FDA feedback. And the FDA says you have 120 days, about 3 months, from the time that these rules are published in the Federal Register. And for the preventative controls rule, that just happened yesterday. So 120 days beginning yesterday to comment on these. And one of the things that I do for clients is to take some time because they are such dense rules. They're very complicated, and they also have a lot of assumptions in them, assumptions both in the rules and in the economic analysis that accompanies them. And so what I'll do for clients is I'll process all of that into a memo and provide it to them and say, does this make sense for your operation? Are these assumptions correct? Is this definition of operations right? There's a lot of definitions within the regulations, from defining compliance dates, which we'll get into, to defining exemptions. And that way, clients can make very informed feedback to the FDA in that process. And so that's what's happening now. We have 120 days to comment on both these rules. And from that, what happens is after that comment period closes, the FDA states that they'll have 60 days to finalize the rules. Whether or not they will make dramatic modifications or any modifications in that 60 days, we'll wait to see. And we'll also wait to see if that 60 days is accurate. We waited a year for the rules themselves. We were a year late. So what their standard is 60 days after that comment period. So we have about 6 months just of getting the rules finalized. And then from there, the FDA has said, we're not going to immediately enforce these new rules. There needs to be time to understand what the finalized rule is and to bring your operations up to speed. And the very interesting thing that the FDA has done in both of these rules is provide a staggered means to compliance. And I've got a lot of detail on my blog about this, and I can touch on it briefly. But what the FDA has said is for the preventative controls rule that large facilities, and we can get into that definition, will have 1 year to bring their operations into compliance after the final rule is updated. And what they have done is they've then broken out a definition for small and very small businesses, food facilities, and those facilities will have about 2 years to comply before they're required to comply with the preventative controls rule. What's very interesting about that is there's a set definition for a small facility, and the FDA is proposing 3 options for a very small facility, and that is based on annual sales. And what I've been talking about in interviews and in webinars is the very small definition only captures about 1 to 1.5% of all food facilities. So not a lot of facilities are going to get swept into this 2-year delay. So that's for the preventative control rules. You can kind of see it's going to take some time for these to come into effect, and I think it gives you a sense that there's a lot in this rule. If the FDA is giving you 2 years to comply or a year to comply, there's a lot to catch up on. And what we also see is a similar approach in the produce safety rule. And the produce safety rule is a really big rule. I mean, I don't know how to emphasize that enough. And what I've been telling clients is there's not been a change in the food safety standard since 1932, 1939. This is the first one and since that time. And what the FDA said in its assumptions about the produce safety rule is that in their economic analysis, they said it was difficult to determine a baseline for compliance, meaning, all facilities are here, and we need to get them up a level to here. The FDA said that they even had a hard time doing that for the produce safety rule. And that gives you a sense of the weight of the rule. And as I get into these dates, I think it also demonstrates that there's a lot to comply with here. So the FDA has said that all facilities that don't fit the very small or small definition will have, let's see what it is, it's 2 years for most of the regulations, and then the water regulations, they're giving facilities more time. So it's 2 years for most of the produce safety rule and 4 years for anything that relates to water, some modifications in that. They have a definition for small and for very small, also that we can get into. For very small facilities, they'll have 4 years to comply, and they have 6 years for most of the water requirements. For small facilities that meet the definition, 3 years to comply and 5 years to meet most of the water requirements. I think that should give a very strong idea of just what is in the produce safety rule and what it's going to take to comply. I mean, even the large facilities, which should be up to if it's a GFSI standard or ISO standard or something that they're doing that's voluntary, it still may take them 2 years to catch up on what's in the produce safety rule. So that's part of why I'm telling clients, engage services, put that investment in now so that you can make sure that those definitions are appropriate and that they'll fit you so that if you need that additional time, you can use it. And also just to be aware of what's happening in these rules because they are so dense that you can understand how they're going to impact your operations and whether they're impacting your operations in a way that is appropriate and based on good assumptions.
Well, Mark, you've certainly outlined a number of areas of concern for our audience. Could you help me understand how your consultations could be customized to a particular manager who is just faced with, like you said, 1,000 pages of documentation that's going to be hitting them at once? So your service would essentially review the documents, then review the operations of the client, and then submit to them a memo that would give them operational details. Is that correct?
That's right. Just looking at the rules themselves, there's a lot of exemptions and qualified exemptions and definitions for activities and for facilities. And so what I try and do is sit down with a client and understand what they do and how their activities and operations work. Because, we can talk, the rules address both micro-contamination and food allergen contamination, something that's very new to have food allergen contamination. So understand, where do they fit in this regulation, and then just to walk them through what it looks like for, preventative control or produce safety regulation for their operations, and get a sense of, are the assumptions that the FDA is making correct? Is this what you've seen in your experience? And also just getting a sense of, is this something that you can comply with, or is it too burdensome, or is it not effective? And, the FDA does ask for some of that feedback. We're going to get into some of the produce safety rules, but there's areas in the produce safety rule where the FDA says, this particular segment may be more costly than what the benefits provide, but we don't know that, and we need feedback from the industry of whether that's the case. And I wrote an article about that for soil amendments that they have for biological contamination and soil amendments. If you're using manure or different things to fertilize, and in that area, the FDA said, based on what we're seeing, the number of illnesses that are going to be prevented is outweighed by the cost of this, but, we're going to continue to go forward with this unless we hear some different feedback on how it can be changed or whether or not that's true. And so that's one of the things I'll do for clients, and that way they understand that that's even something they can provide feedback on, and that they can provide a very detailed and, cogent response to the FDA.
Well, Mark, that's an alignment with one of my life's mantras. That is, in life we're looking for simple answers to challenging questions which we can easily understand and directly apply. What you're saying also is that one of your services is to look at a client's operations and respond to the request for information from the FDA on their behalf. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And I think it's something that's so vital to do because from a regulatory standpoint, so much of what I do is in the regulations, and then when I go into a facility, regulations don't always meet reality in a way that is effective. There's just a way to do operations that it makes employee time easier, that actually maybe reduces contamination in a way that the regs didn't think of. And so it's important to get that regulation to meet that reality and to get a sense of how that works in your facility, because it's such a diverse industry that we're in. You can go from a seafood plant to something like produce, that they're cutting up produce. Very different applications of the same rule.
Well, that's an excellent lead into our next topic, which is, what is a produce safety rule exemptions?
Well, both rules have exemptions, which is wonderful, and that we can kind of get into what that means for facilities. The produce safety rule is the one that has the most exemptions, or the most clear exemptions. And what I've been cautioning as I give these webinars and I talk with clients is, I wouldn't call them exemptions. I would call them rule modifications, because in most cases these exemptions actually say, for example, provisions 1 through 8 don't apply, but provisions 9 through 12 do. And so you don't want to get into that mindset that when I say an exemption, that always means none of the rules apply. And so I can go through the list real quick. There's 5 outlined exemptions. There's a specific, and it has to be on the list, of commodities that are rarely consumed raw, those things that are traditionally cooked and just never eaten raw. And the FDA has a set list on what those include. Produce that is used for personal or on-farm consumption, or that is a raw agricultural commodity. That's the second exemption. Produce that receives a commercial processing that adequately reduces the presence of a microorganism, the so-called kill step exemption. And again, this is a qualified exemption where there's some documentation that has to be kept about what the kill step is, the effectiveness of the kill step, and there's a whole lot that's entailed there. So it's not an absolute exemption. A fourth exemption are farms that average annual value of food sold during the previous 3-year period, and this is a continuing moving target, the previous 3-year period of $25,000 or less. So, for example, when the produce safety rule comes out and it becomes effective, this exemption would apply, say the rule comes in effect in 2013. So for 2012, 2011, and 2010, did you have sales of $25,000 or less? And then as we get into 2014, if you had 1 year where it bumped up, this exemption doesn't apply. So it's a moving target that it's really important to pay attention to. And finally, there's a qualified exemption which modifies some of the requirements for farms that meet two requirements. One, you have to be a farm that has food sales averaging less than $500,000 per year, again, during the last 3 years. And then the second requirement is that farms sell to qualified end users. And again, there's some definitional things there. And it must not exceed your sales to qualified end users must not exceed your sales to others. So there's two components there. So, I think one or two of these are solid if you fit in this category. Produce safety rule doesn't apply to you. But for the most part, most of them are the produce safety rule applies in some ways or requires some additional documentation to maintain the exemption. And those are for the produce safety rule, and we can get a little bit into what's in the preventative controls rules as well if you like.
Yes, let's talk about food safety plans, who can write them for the facility, and what's a qualified individual. There's a whole debate about that. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So the preventative control rule, if we were to distill it down to an elevator pitch in one sentence, it's basically taking this hazard analysis and critical control point methodology, the HACCP methodology that has applied to seafood, to juice facilities, larger facilities that are voluntarily doing HACCP, that methodology to all facilities, that don't fit either an exemption because you're already doing it. Seafood is exempt because they already are doing it. They're already doing the HACCP method in their facilities, or you meet some of the criteria for, the exemptions are the very small and the like. So that's one component. And then the other component is there's modifications to the good manufacturing practices. So I like just to start at the beginning by making that distinction and letting facilities know if you're a juice facility or a seafood facility and you have a HACCP plan, that's fantastic. Now you've met half of the preventative control rule. You need to look at the other half of the preventative control rule, which is the good manufacturing practices. But for all those facilities that are just catching up to the HACCP methodology, they have to write a food safety plan. Food safety plan is enumerated in the regulation about what it must include, what it may include. Basically, you're looking at what are those hazards that are reasonably likely to occur and how do you prevent them. And what the FDA, I think, has done, and I think what they're responding to is in large part the Jensen recall. We saw the Jensen recall about a year and a half ago with the cantaloupe. And what the nugget that we kind of took from that recall is that there was a third-party auditor that came in and said, your facility looks great, you're doing everything that, you get a checklist and you're fine and you can keep going. But it turned out that there were some areas that either weren't there when the auditor was there or something happened. And so now we have this debate about who can be a third-party auditor. That debate, I believe, in looking at the regulation, has carried over to food safety plans. The FDA says we don't want just anyone coming in and writing a food safety plan. We need to have two things happen. And there's this long discussion in the rule. I think it's about maybe 10 or 15 pages dedicated to it in the regulation, and then a great deal of time dedicated to it in the economic analysis. And what the FDA said is two things. We want someone, this qualified individual, that's the person who can write and monitor and kind of verify a food safety plan for a facility. We want this qualified individual to either have training or experience that meets a standard set criteria. They haven't said what that criteria is, but what they've done in the past is they've worked with state and industry to develop a set curriculum. So that person has to meet that curriculum either through going through that course that will be developed, or they have that experience that is equivalent to that course. And the second thing the FDA has said is we can't, in the regulations they say, we can't necessarily say what that course is going to look like now, but generally they want someone that is able to understand where the preventative controls need to happen. They need to be able to work with microbiologists, and they need to be able to work with some of the different people in the facility to understand the scientific data that is coming out of the facility. They want someone that really has that experience to understand what is happening in the facility. And what we've talked about, those of us in the industry who've looked at the rule is, yes, this is fantastic. We want people that are going to be very helpful in the facility. we don't want to kind of create a situation where anyone can come in and write a food safety plan and then, it isn't effective. But at the same time, it's a very interesting dynamic that the FDA is creating, because they're saying that most facilities will have 1 year to comply. Everyone else will, if you fit into that small wedge of small or very small, will have 2 years to comply. So what we're kind of wondering is, that's a lot of facilities that need to write food safety plans. How are we going to get everyone to compliance? Because that's one of two pieces of the preventative control rule. How do we get everyone to compliance and still meet that qualified individual definition? So there's kind of some debate about, will that initial bar for what is a qualified individual be kind of low because we have so many facilities that need to come up to speed, or will the FDA be very stringent in it and say, this is the course, this is the requirements that you need to demonstrate, and if that creates a scarcity in the market of qualified individuals, then that's the way it is. So that's been kind of the debate that's gone on, is who is this qualified individual, and how do you demonstrate that you are a qualified individual based on experience or training?
Very good. Now that leads to the next question. What about the enforcement of these new regulations? And the follow-up question is this new FSMA application sufficiently funded?
Yeah, I think it's a well-known secret that FSMA isn't funded. Food safety circles and the media, this was talked about a lot, and the commissioner of the FDA has even acknowledged that it needs more money from Congress to be enforced, to adequately enforced. And what they're largely talking about is having enough agents, enough boots on the ground that can go into these facilities, can look to see if you have a food safety plan, see if you're following the produce safety rule standards, and so on. And right now, the FDA isn't quite there. And there's two things that I get this question a lot in media interviews, and clients love to ask this question. I think it's the number one client question is, why go through the expense of compliance if I'm not going to be caught? And there's two things that I answer this to clients about enforcement with the FDA. Number one is what we have seen when the FDA has been granted a new power under FSMA, and when that power becomes effective, the FDA uses it. We can see that with suspension of facility registration. I think it was within 4 to 6 weeks of receiving that authority to suspend a facility's registration to meet certain criteria. The FDA used it in New Mexico for I think it was Sunland, the peanut butter company. They suspended that registration. When they got the ability for administrative detention, I think within 2 to 3 months they used that authority. Time after time, what we've seen is that when the FDA gets this new authority, there isn't a hesitation to execute it. And I think the mindset of the FDA may be to find some high-profile targets or to find some really egregious examples, and those that will get some good play, good press, and to exercise that authority in a way to set an example. And I think that's something that we've seen. And what I tell clients is, don't be that person, don't be that facility that gets caught and makes an example of. And also, the risk may, I said this in the Huffington Post article, that the risk may be low, but those penalties, when you get under FSMA has teeth. And, those penalties are going to hurt. If it's facility registration, reinspection fees, the list can go on, and it's going to hurt. And the other thing, I'm kind of saving this, and I'm presenting in February at the Food Manufacturing Safety Forum, and this is the meat of my topic that they've asked me to address. What is the impact of FSMA been in the food industry? And this kind of gets to the heart of the second point I make with clients, is that really the goal of FSMA, and when FSMA came into being, when it was finally passed, it was on the heels of some really high-profile legislation, recalls. And so we had, spinach recalls and some others that happened. And even as these rules were being promulgated and formed, we had the Jensen Farm recall. And what we saw in those recalls was some very horrible illnesses for some people, and very intense litigation. food safety litigation, foodborne illness litigation has really changed, and it's really aggressive. And you look at the Jensen case, and, I think Jensen ended up going bankrupt, and the plaintiffs are going all the way to the end of the retail carrier of the product for suit. And if you look at the Jensen recall, the Jensen recall and the Jensen food litigation was occurring under a voluntary standard. They were more or less accused of not following a guidance document by the FDA. That document is non-binding recommendations and typically really old. I think the one for Jensen has been around for 10 or 15 years and haven't been updated. Now what we have in FSMA, if you look at the preventative controls, you look at the produce safety rule, you have set requirements, set mandates in law, in the Code of Federal Regulations that aren't being followed. So if you're in a situation where you have an outbreak or people get sick, not only with microcontamination, also now with food allergies, not only do you have this really compelling story that someone comes in, and Andy, I know you've heard a lot of these stories in your experience about how horrific that illness can be, how widespread it can be. People like with E. coli lose part of their stomach. Really compelling testimony. And then you couple that with, now that you have a FSMA requirement, you essentially broke the law. That's really going to change food litigation. And so on those two ends, I tell clients, think of FSMA as a standard that you're following to protect your consumers in order to protect your brand. And if you do that, that investment will be well worth it.
Well, Mark, I need to endorse at this point all your remarks and to just wrap an envelope around it and say this is a very serious topic. One of my clients was actually invaded by a force. Now, when you say FDA, what you really mean is the Public Health Service, and that's actually a branch of the military through the Centers for Disease Control. And they also come with state officers. They come in groups, and they take swab samples all over your facility. They issue letters, this is from the state, out to your customers and their suppliers. It's not a pretty picture. One of my clients lost a great deal of resources on that experience, which could have been avoided. The challenge was that we were brought in a little bit late, but I wholeheartedly endorse your recommendation, Mark, to have an evaluation, A, B, to comply with now the new regulations as opposed to the old, which were suggestions. Now we're looking at actual laws. So,
yeah,
Mark,
absolutely.
you endorsed 100% your recommendations.
And there's nothing more intimidating than having this swarm of people come to your facility and the intense pressure of that situation. And that pressure, I think, is coupled because you're really losing damage to your brand, and it's really difficult to recover that. But you get a lot of pressure from industry. I think if you look at any of the big outbreaks, from cantaloupes to spinach, you see a depression in the prices for that whole commodity. Not just cantaloupes, but you saw a dip in prices from all melon groups. And that's a lot of pressure that you're going to receive from within your own industry that, that apple has now affected my operations, and I'm taking the time to be in compliance. So, it's not a fun situation to be in at all.
In the contrast to that situation, I had another client which actually took aggressive steps to increase their food safety program and did some other things which I don't think are appropriate for today's discussion. But what they found was an increased value in their product from their buyers. They were willing to pay a higher price as a result of those increased efforts. Well, let's
Absolutely.
talk now about...
it is a value added.
Excellent. Mark, let's move on to recall plans. We have seen in this new regulation a particular emphasis on recall plans.
Absolutely, and I think that this has been very exciting to see in the preventative controls. It's something that I've advocated for with clients constantly. It seems like is, have a recall plan ready and even do mock recalls. I'll do a mock recall with some of my clients so they get a sense of what it feels like to get that call at on Friday at 6 p.m. or something where you don't have a CEO in the office or you don't have a quality assurance in the office, but you have someone, that doesn't really know what to do. And what the FDA has said in the preventative controls rule is a preventative control includes a recall plan. So it's already big news that we have a food safety plan, and now we have this recall plan. And this dovetails very nicely. What's been interesting for me and kind of a headache is the FDA is taking this piecemeal approach to the legislation. We'll get record keeping over here, we'll get a produce safety rule, we'll get a preventative control, and it's very difficult to figure out how these all dovetail and work together because no rule stands alone. They all work together. And this is one example where we finally get to see the meshing of two rules that were released separately. When FSMA first came into effect, we had mandatory recall authority given to the FDA. Very first time that we've seen this. We haven't seen it exercised in large part because the FDA provides a window for you to voluntarily recall your product and to do that without FDA intervention. This kind of dovetails with that. What the FDA is basically saying is you have that opportunity to do a voluntary recall. We want you to have a food safety plan in place so that if you need to do that voluntary recall, you have the means to do it. And if the FDA steps in and requires a mandatory recall, they're not coming in and telling you how to run a recall. They're telling you you need to issue the recall and follow your recall plan. And so the FDA has even enumerated some of the steps, about notifying purchasers, notifying the public, effectiveness checks, how to dispose of recalled food. All of that is tied into the preventative controls rule and this requirement for a recall plan. So I think this is an excellent example of being proactive, which is sort of the stance of the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's all about being proactive rather than reactive. And it's also a really great example of seeing at last how the very scattered parts of the regulation finally dovetail and kind of flow together. So this is something that if facilities don't have this, it's going to be part of that time when they're doing the food safety plan to address and figure out who's responsible and how this works and making sure that it does work.
Well, Mark, I have to join with you in saying that a food safety plan has as a fundamental component a recall component and protocol, and it is a typical part of a traditional food safety plan, and I endorse all of that. Let's focus on what is the primary emphasis of the produce safety rule as far as water, soil, and employee hygiene.
Yeah, this is a great question because produce safety, like I mentioned at the beginning, the FDA said we're not even sure where the industry is on a lot of this. So they're asking for a lot of feedback on where this is. And the produce safety rule, what the FDA did is they went to a lot of industry experts. They went to a lot of food safety experts to say, where can we trace out with certain outbreaks? Where can we trace back the source of contamination? And more or less taking a food safety plan on a very meta level for an industry and saying where are the preventative control spots in this industry. And what they did is they identified, it's about 5 or 6. They said agricultural water, biological soil amendment, health and hygiene and training of employees, domesticated and wild animals, equipment, tools, and buildings were the 5 main areas that they traced back contamination. And as you look in the economic analysis of what that research yielded, they even broke it down to the number of outbreaks associated with each of those areas. And then they also took some time, and I think it's a little bit interesting to look at, they broke out a separate category for sprout and for training. And I think it's no surprise we, in the food safety circles, had kind of wondered what the treatment of sprouts would be. We thought they would end up more likely on the higher risk food list, which would have some additional record keeping and standards around that. But what the FDA has said, even in the production and harvesting of sprouts, there's some standards that need to go there. And anyone that has looked at FDA recalls or food safety isn't surprised, I think, by that. I think sprouts have been one of those areas that have had an association with a lot of outbreaks. But what the FDA has said in each of these areas is that there are some requirements or some standards. For example, with agricultural water, it requires that at the beginning of growing season, the system components under farms control are inspected, and if there's a reasonable likely to introduce pathogens, then they need to take some preventative measures to correct that. And there have some specific criteria for the quality of agricultural water, the same thing with each of these areas. And what I found interesting is there isn't a lot of overlap, which is kind of nice between the preventative control and the produce safety rules. And so it really is taking this holistic approach that everywhere in the food chain, from the way that their food is grown to the way that it is processed, is going through a different standard. And so the only place that you see a little bit of overlap is with health and hygiene of employees. And the produce safety rule is very specific. They have about 4 or 5 areas that require farms to use hygienic practices. They mandate hand washing and training and all these different areas in the produce safety rule. You see a suggestion of that in the preventative control rule. It's a permissive, should require that. So, there's a lot of detail. There's 600 pages dedicated, about 500 or 600 pages dedicated really just to these 5 or 6 topics. I'm not sure how much detail to get into there, but that's the basic approach that the FDA took, was to find where the microcontamination was, and they identified these 5 or 6 areas, and then they addressed how they can remedy that. They provided a list of standards in each of these areas that need to take some time. And it's based on the regulations. Water seems to be the largest, and it seems to be one of the areas that the FDA understands is going to take the most time to bring up to speed. And I mentioned at the beginning that there's a separate breakout for compliance dates for most of the water requirements.
Well, Mark, that is an excellent area for us to conclude on. Just to let you know, one of my clients is the government of Mexico, and I've actually been out there and collecting water samples, and there's a real discussion, territory, if you will, between the EPA and the FDA, and the whole issue of irrigation water is, again, like you just phrased it, it's a big area to take on, and it's an important area. Well, we'd like to conclude now. Go ahead, Mark. Did you have a comment on that?
No, I was just going to agree with you. I said, that the EPA isn't mentioned in that, and I think there's some tension there in the regulation about where those boundaries are, and so it will be interesting to see how this rule is finalized.
Excellent. And I think all those other areas as well, the soil, health, training, animals, the equipment, the tools, the building, the sprouts, all of those issues will come into the final regulations. And let me just phrase this. You are equipped as an attorney to consult and offer your professional opinion as a response to the regulations for clients. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and I've spent a lot of time since these rules came out. I've covered a lot of the material, and people can find me on my blog. I'm continuing to provide just basic summaries of each of these sections, and so I encourage people to go there, and if they need some additional assistance, I'm happy to provide that.
Well, Mark, I appreciate your time that you've invested with us today, particularly the issues that you have raised with the areas of enforcement. I've had personal experience in that. It's a very unpleasant experience. The food safety plans, that is something that if a company or organization involved in food doesn't have one already, you've made it very loud and clear that they had better engage in that process with an authorized auditing consulting firm, as well as knowing where they sit in that exemption parameter, whether they're exempt and what from. You've also talked about comments and compliance dates. Those are all critical to modern food producers. I'd like to now allow you, Mark, a closing remark, particularly emphasizing and focusing your suggestions to food producing managers, food quality managers, food safety managers, and food security managers.
I think my final message is, for 2 years since FSMA came out, it's been a very stealth piece of legislation. I think a lot in the industry haven't paid attention to it, and they haven't had reason to pay attention to it. There's been some small provisions that have come out, and they've been quickly absorbed. Mandatory recall authority, for example, very easy to absorb and to continue going. What I want to say now is we are getting to the meat and to the really heart of what FSMA is. These are dense. These are very complicated rules. There's a lot of material here, and this material is becoming effective. So now is sort of the time to get out of the mode of not paying attention to FSMA and to start engaging in it, because this is 2 of about 7 rules and some additional coming down. So within this year, there's going to be thousands of pages of regulations that you're going to need to understand, you're going to need to be able to incorporate into your operation, and you're going to need to figure out how to get in compliance by the date that's provided. And nothing like this has happened in the food industry, and the FDA is enforcing it. So it really is, the FSMA beast is finally awake, and I think it's, it's something to be paying attention to now.
Well, Mark, I'd like to express my personal appreciation for your appearance on the show, and also invite you back on the show when these regulations have been formalized and when they actually come down to the must-dos, which is what most of the listeners really want to hear. Your preemptive advice, I'm sure, will be well taken, and I'm sure many of our clients, many of our listeners will become your clients as they chat with you. Your contact information is listed on the web page. Would you like to add any other advice or consult before we close this interview?
Not at all. Thank you for having me, and it'd be a pleasure to come back.
Thank you so much, Mark. Have a great day.
You as well, Andy.
Bye now.